mechanism for people having food during Shemitta, and that is what's called the Otzer Beis Din. So now a little more background on the concept of an Otzer Beis Din. We know that, number one, on Shemitta you're not allowed to farm the land, that's obvious, but you are allowed to do what you might call maintenance so that the plants would not die. So for example, if you have trees, you could not fertilize the trees, but you are allowed to do enough work so that the trees or the fruits on the tree will not die. So that would mean a minimal amount of water, etc. If there's some disease in the tree or in the fruit, you're allowed to try to address that. You're not allowed to fertilize, you're not allowed to do things that enhance growth, but you are allowed to prevent the tree from dying or even the fruits of that year from dying. Obviously, with respect to vegetables and grain, there's really nothing you can do at all because it's sapichem, so whatever grows is going to be Otzer. But for fruit, we would say there's a certain amount of maintenance you can do. You will also remember, though, that Shemitah fruit is hefker. It must be available for every Jew, and therefore, even if I'm the owner of an apple orchard, I am not allowed to keep Yidden out of the apple orchard. They have to be able to take the apples that they want and harvest them in small quantities. I can also harvest them in daily quantities, but I'm no better than anybody else. Now, here's the thing. It was already understood that the makor of Otzer Beis Din is from a Tosefta, so it actually does have a makor in the halachas of the Tanoim themselves. There was a concept that if the purpose of Shemitah is to enable everybody to have access to that fruit, well, most of us are not going to schlep out. I'm not going to drive up or take a bus up to Tveria or whatever it is to go into an apple orchard, whatever it is. So the concept of distributing Peiros Shavios to everybody, b'teiras hefker, is not realistic when you have most people living in cities and they're at some distance from the agricultural settlements. So the question becomes, how do you promote the Torah's value that Peiros of Shemitah should be available to everybody? Not only the poor, by the way. I don't mean just poor, anybody. So the concept was that what Beis Din would do is, Beis Din would appoint sholuchim, emissaries, to maintain the produce in permissible ways. In other words, not by enhancing growth, but preventing the death of the tree or the death of the fruit. And then they would arrange for centralized transportation to urban centers where the peiros would then be distributed to people for free. And the only thing is, Beis Din could charge for the cost of transportation and the cost of the maintenance, right? So that is the theory of Otzer Beis Din. So which means peiros that are sold under an Otzer Beis Din are, number one, from Shemitah compliant farms. That means Jewishly owned farms where the owners are not doing prohibited labor. They are only doing the maintenance labor that the halacha allows you to do. Okay, that's what I mean by a Shemitah compliant farm. Number two, the peiros b'etzem are hefker. So they are being distributed to the general public for free. Number three, you pay for the harvest activity, because otherwise we could say, hey, you go and you harvest the apples. Why should you get what I harvest from me for free? So you charge for the harvesting and for the transportation, but not for the fruit. And therefore, Otzer Beis Din accomplishes a number of things. It gives farmers parnasa for their labor, not for their fruit, but for their labor. It enables consumers who live far away from agricultural centers to fulfill what the Ramban says is the positive mitzvah of eating the produce of Shemitah with the holiness of Shemitah. And theoretically, if you would go to the field yourself, you could harvest it for free, right? They couldn't stop you. Even if you went to an Otzer Beis Din field and you say, I'm here to pick up my apples, they absolutely could not stop you from going in and getting the apples for free. But if you're going to go to an Otzer Beis Din store and you're going to take the apples that they picked and that they transported, they are entitled to ask for the cost of their transportation and their cost of their harvest. So what you've accomplished is you've created a parnasa for Shemitta farmers, although technically they're not selling the fruit, they are simply getting paid as employees of the Beis Din, whichever Beis Din is supervising it. And number two, whatever you get in Otzer Beis Din has Kedushat Shvi'it. Again, be sure you picture very clearly the difference between Otzer Beis Din and Heter Mechira. In Heter Mechira, because the land is sold to a non-Jew, the Jewish farmer is allowed, if you hold of the Heter Mechira, the Jewish farmer is allowed to do all activities, fertilizer, everything else. By Otzer Beis Din, the land is not sold to a goy. The Jewish farmer is only allowed to do maintenance activities. Moreover, in the case of the Heter Mechira, the peiros do not have Shemitah Kedusha, so they can be sold. You can charge for the peiros. They're bichlal not hefker, because technically they belong to the guy, but under the deal, basically the Jew is going to get the money for them. And Heter Mechira does not have Kedusha, if you hold of it, of course. Many people don't hold it. If you hold of the Heter Mechira, it does not have Kedusha Shvi'as. The money can be charged for the fruit itself, but the Jewish farmer is able to do all activities, including activities that enhance growth. Yeah?
For the Otzer Beis Din option, how much fruit are they allowed to harvest at one time?
So this is an important point. I should have made this point. Since the Otzer Beis Din is not harvesting the fruit for private ownership, but for distribution to the public as hefker. Essentially, it's hefker. The fruit is hefker. Again, you don't think of it that way, because you walk into an Otzer Beis Din, if you try to walk out with an apple, they'll call the police. But technically, I am walking into a store where all of the peiros in this store are hefker. So since this is not a harvest for private use, you can harvest the whole field at one time, but they still do it with shinuyim, meaning they won't use a commercial harvester, they'll use a sickle or whatever, but they are not limited in quantities, because the issue of quantities is when you're taking it for private use, so you can only take limited quantities. Did you want to say, yeah?
These farmers who don't want to sell their farms, is it that they rather just want to take the land?
Yeah.
Harvest it? Do they not hold market mechira, or what are the other reasons that they don't want to sell their land?
Are you talking about Otzer Beis Din farmers, or? Well, once again, we discussed that at great length, that according to the Chazon Ish, for example, it's an Isser D'Oraisa to sell land to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. So consequently, there are many, Sir Rav Kook gave arguments that it would be okay, but there are many who don't accept those arguments. So consequently, if I'm a religious man, and I believe it's forbidden to sell my land to a non-Jew, then I'm not going to do that. But the Otzer Beis Din is another option where I can get some parnasa for my labor costs, acting as a shaliach of the supervising Beis Din that I sign up with, meaning you kind of sign up with a Beis Din, and that enables a stream of income, again, not because of the peiros, but because of the malacha, the tircha, the transportation, and the like. Now,
with regards to these, I often find that the price for Otzer Beis Din are heard to be equal, if not more expensive.
Yeah.
So is there profit involved? Like, how is that possible?
So this is really a problem. Now, the Otzer Beis Din, although it sounds really, really good, it's a way of Kedushat Shvi'it, compliance with Shemitah, and still giving the farmer a parnasa based on his labor costs. There are some who don't like the Otzer Beis Din. Many argue the Heter Mechira is better than the Otzer Beis Din. I mean, there's a problem with everything. That's really the issue. And part of the problem is that there seems to be a certain amount of deception here, and that is sometimes they adjust the so-called salary of the farmer to be equal to the fair market value of the produce. So it's a matter of manipulating a label. They say, we're not charging for the fruit, we are just charging for the labor, but in point of fact, they peg the labor cost to be equal to the cost of the fruit. So that actually is a serious argument against the Otzer based in idea. But of course, Heter Mechira too, there are those that argue the sale is a joke. Meaning, if you're talking about haramas, there are accusations of harama on both sides of the equation. But again, let me emphasize though, that because, and I said this yesterday, I'll say it again, because Otzer based in is premised on a field not being sold to a guy that has the holiness of Shemitah, that means the grain and the vegetables that grow in an Otzer based in field are absolutely prohibited because of sapichim. Because a Jewishly owned field, the grains and the vegetables are usher, unless, as the Chazon Ish said, some of it started growing before Shemitah. Which means, for all practical purposes, an Otzer based in mechanism can only get you Shemitah fruit. An Otzer based in mechanism cannot get you bread, pasta, cookies, cake, tomatoes, and the like, because legabe the tomatoes, legabe the mazonos, it's vegetables and grain, and that is a problem of sapichim. As opposed to Heter Mechira, that can get you everything because there's no din of sapichim bichlal on that which grows in a non-Jewish owned field. So that doesn't mean you're not going to find tomatoes in an Otzer based in, but all that means is the tomatoes are either shishis or chutz la'aretz, or like the Chazon Ish, they began growing before Shemitah, so you'll find it. But the point is, as the year gets longer and longer, as you get later into the Shemitah, you will find a shortage of vegetables because most of the vegetables that would be available now began growing during Shemitah. Okay, so that's a very important point. Otzer based in will not give you access to all types of food. It will only give you access to fruits, and for vegetables and grain, you're going to have to rely on other things, which again, the Otzer based in stores may have them, but not because of Otzer based in. They'll have them based on the other types of heterim that there are. Yeah.
Sorry, Sapichin, is it Asr Bahana and Asr Bechil, or just?
Yeah, Sapichim are Asr Bahana as well. So you're not even allowed to sell them even to a guy, or whatever it would be. Yeah.
When you're making your tree in your backyard, you don't have to leave your door open all the time, right? You can just put up a sign.
Yeah, so the halacha is that if you are afraid of animals or Arabs or whatever crime, so you are allowed to close your gate and leave a sign with your phone number or email or whatever it is where they can reach you. Now again, people aren't going to do it usually, but theoretically they can call you up and they can say, I want to pick up some apples at a certain time of day. Okay, so this is the concept of Otzer based in, and therefore there are whole svarim written with the title of Otzer based in versus Heter Mechira, and these are kind of the two issues. Again, I do want to remind you that Ramban actually says eating peiros with the kedusha of Shemitah is actually a mitzvah saseh min haTorah. It's actually a mitzvah to eat peiros shavias. Which means, if you think about it, Otzer based in is actually the only one in which the consumer is fulfilling that mitzvah. Every other option is kind of getting out of Shemitah, whether it's 6-year produce, whether it's non-Jewish produce, whether it's matzah menutak, the hydroponic greenhouse, heter mechira, right? All of these things are ways in which the laws of Shemitah don't apply, and therefore your life is easier. The only mechanism in which you are actually fulfilling Shemitah, both as a farmer and as a consumer, like the Ramban, where eating the peiros shavias is a fulfillment of a doraisa, is Otzer based in. So everything else is a way of getting out of Shemitah. Otzer based in is a way of trying to fulfill Shemitah. So spiritually, many people like Otzer based in. But as I say, there are halachic problems with the Otzer based in, particularly the idea that the farmer's labor cost happened to be the same as the cost of the fruit. That itself raises some concerns. I also want to point out, although I haven't studied this extent, I can't say I know for sure, but it seems logical, and I think that is the case, that the quality of Otzer based in produce is going to be a little inferior. And the reason is because the only cultivation that was permitted was maintenance cultivation. You couldn't do things that would greatly enhance. On the other hand, one might say, well, should that be true? Does not the Torah give us a bracha that if we keep Shemitah, there'll be... But the truth is, if you look at it, the bracha is not that the Shemitah fruit will be good. The Torah's bracha is you'll have more in the 6th year, etc. In other words, there is no bracha that the wild fruit that grows during Shemitah is going to be of a great quality. It's interesting. That's not even nichlal explicitly in the bracha. And as a result, as a general rule, the fruit that grows wild during Shemitah is not going to be of the same quality because you're not allowed to do the malachos that would make it better. So, again, I might be wrong. I have not done a survey of the Otzer Basin, but I do think that the quality might be less than Heter Mechira. Now, of course, that's not a reason to choose. I mean, you're not going to say, "Oh, I go with Heter Mechira because the grapes are better." I mean, that's not a legitimate halachic consideration, but it is a mitzias. Yeah.
With regard to eating Shemitah produce, is that rabbinic nowadays?
Yes, it would have to be that way. In other words, obviously, if the whole institution of Shemitah is midrabanan, then the mitzvah of eating fruit that has the holiness of Shemitah has to be drabanan as well, because the Raisa, there's no holiness of Shemitah. So it's all going to be connected to all of those things. Yeah.
Really mentioned the bracha that's given to people who keep Shemitah.
Yeah.
I guess, what are the facts on the ground? Like, do farmers see clearly like the bracha that the Torah?
Yeah. So first, let me just make a point that the great bracha that the Torah promises for those who keep Shemitah, that you will have this extraordinary fertility on the 6th year, that will support you for the 6th year, the 7th year, and even into the 8th year until you have a harvest. So first of all, there's a huge machlokas. Does that bracha apply when Shemitah is midrabanan? Because remember, we talked about Rav Kook, that part of why Rav Kook developed, he didn't invent, but he developed the Heter Mechira, was because of widespread starvation among farmers and among consumers. Now, one might ask, and there was, I mean, you can't deny that, Rav Kook didn't make that up, but the question is, hey, how could there be widespread starvation for farmers who want to keep Shemitah? What about the bracha of the Torah, right? So one of the answers that are given, which is kind of a hard answer, is, well, if Shemitah is drabanan, you don't have God's promise necessarily, because it's not a Shemitah min HaTorah. This is a machlokas, if a Shemitah drabanan carries the Birchas Hashem. Chazon Ish actually said it does. So like that, you have a kasha, so how come there's going to be starvation? Or even in modern times. You will notice that before Shemitah, even during Shemitah, we have all sorts of tzedakah campaigns. Let's give money, Keren Hashviyas. Let's give money for the heroic farmers who don't have a parnasa during Shemitah, and we can support them, and they can learn in Kollel and everything else. In other words, there's a problem. There are people who are suffering and struggling during Shemitah. Well, why is that? Now, again, for me to simply say, like it's a fact, oh, I'm not giving you any money because Hashem gave you a bracha, that would be cruel, because Lamaisa they are suffering. So I'm not attacking the charity campaigns. There is a need for that tzedakah. But I'm asking, why is there a need? What about the bracha of Hashem? So one answer is Shemitah D'Rabbanan. Another answer is that maybe the bracha that Hashem gave is only if Am Yisrael as a whole is keeping Shemitah. If most of Am Yisrael, most of the farmers are not keeping Shemitah, the Yachid may be in trouble, may not necessarily have a bracha. It's like many things. All of the brachos that, if you keep the mitzvos, you will have health and wealth. The Ramban himself writes that only applies to the nation of Israel. It does not apply to individual people. So that might be a second answer. Now, having said that, I do want to tell you that even Bisman Hazeh, there are many, many, many individual stories of farmers who were zeicha to really miraculous harvest. So we can't say that the full blessing of the Torah is going to apply in every case, either because it's midrabanan or because we still don't have most of the farmers keeping Shemitah. But on an individual basis, there is no question whatsoever that there have been many, many miracles. There are farmers who will come forth and say, the guy that owns the farm right next door to me is not religious, he doesn't keep Shemitah, there was a drought that wiped out his crop, and I had like triple. So you can actually find these stories if you look for them, and you can just Google Shemitah miracles or whatever it is, and you'll come across the stories. But we do have to say that it's not everybody gets that. And that's because, as I say, either Shemitah's Drabanan or it requires most of Am Yisrael keeping Shemitah.
The incentive for a farmer nowadays would be like just because doing this is the right thing to do. I mean,
Yeah, basically.
Even like we shouldn't be telling them necessarily that we promise you that you're going to see like a farmer who's necessarily religious. We're trying to convince them to keep Shemitah.
Yeah, that's a very dangerous. First of all, that's a very dangerous outreach tactic generally. I say, become from, and you'll become a millionaire. I mean, you can't work that way. The other thing, which I think is a little more theologically problematical, I'm not sure if we're permitted to say this, is that even though the Torah says that if you keep Shemitah, you will have a crop yield. Maybe that's only the example the Torah is saying that you'll be taken care of. So it happens to be that in those days, the way you were taken care of was your crops would be a very good yield. But maybe today, now that we have these tzedakah institutions and funds, so that's taken care of you. In other words, the bracha of Hashem is being mekoyam through the different avenues that we've created. I'm a little reluctant to say that because that's like saying, the Torah is lav dafka. The Torah gave one particular bracha, but it's lav dafka that bracha. That's a little, so again, don't send me hate mail on this. But I'm just offering it as a possibility that the bracha of Hashem is, you will have parnasa. Right? So it doesn't have to bedafka take that particular form. By the way, there's a beautiful vort, I don't know if I mentioned it before, from the Seporno. Because when the Torah introduces the bracha, the way the Torah says it is, and when you will say, what will we eat during the 7th year if we're not allowed to plant? And the like, Hashem says, I will command the land to give you a bracha, and you'll have more than you normally have that will cover the 6th year, the 7th year, and even the 8th year. But note that the bracha is prefaced by, if you will say, what will we eat? Well, what if you're not going to say that? What if you're not going to complain? Hashem is only going to give you the bracha if you complain? Hashem will only give you the bracha if you are worried? What if you don't worry? That would be paradoxical. The person who has so much emunah that he doesn't worry, Hashem says, I'm not going to give you any bracha. You didn't ask. You didn't complain. So the Seporno says a very interesting chiddush. He says, the biggest bracha that Hashem can give you in life is not a bracha of quantity. It's a bracha of quality. Like Pirkei Avos says, Ezeu Asher, who is the truly wealthy person? Hasameach b'chelko, he who rejoices in his lot. So he says, for the Maimon, he doesn't need Hashem to give him a lot of grain. He will be given the bracha of feeling full and satisfied and content with even very little. But Nebuch, if you're a person that sees a little bit and says, I'm worried, it's not good enough. So Hashem says there's almost a consolation prize. Okay, I have to give you a lot of stuff, otherwise you don't feel the bracha of Hashem. But the real bracha of Hashem is Sameach B'chelkei. It's a very, very beautiful idea. I remember the Seporno. The Seporno in Parshas Bahar, in this pasuk. Riboy ha'echos sameach b'chelkei is the real birchas Hashem, but for mechusrei amana, people who don't have amuna, so Hashem says, okay, I'll have to give you a lot of stuff, otherwise you don't feel you got a bracha from me. I remember years ago, I was not even living in Eretz Yisrael. My wife and I were visiting, our family was visiting, so I remember on Shmuel Hanavi, Makolet, capital of the world, whatever it is, every other thing is a Makolet there. So 4 kids were walking in the street, and they were sharing a popsicle Four kids were sharing one popsicle. And they were having such a great time. I still remember they were laughing and smiling and joking. They were really having a ball that they had this delicious popsicle that they were sharing among the four of them. Now, obviously, this was a family that, unless they were B'davka doing precious or something, but this was a family that probably didn't have money if you can only afford one popsicle for four kids. But they were really enjoying it. Then I think about the fact that, an American kid, even a 10-year-old, might complain if he has to share a bedroom with his brother, or they don't have their own TV, you got to share a television, computer, whatever it would be. How a person can have so much and not be happy, and you can have so little and have real simcha. And again, Pirkei Avos doesn't need my haskama, but the idea that true ashiras is samech b'chelkai is such a true idea. And the Sforno says that would be the real bracha of Shemitah. The real bracha of Shemitah would be samech b'chelkai. But if a person hasn't reached that madrega, so Hashem will have to give him a lot to kind of compensate him for that. But as I say, the two ikar mahalchim, why there may not be a bracha in individual cases, is number one, because Shemitah is Rabbanan, although this is discussed, and number two, because you don't have Rov Am Yisrael keeping Shemitah. But Eino Chinami, there are Vadai many stories about Yechidim who were given great brachas in the merit of their keeping Shemitah. Okay, so again, just to be sure I got my whole list here. So we talked about Yevul Chol, we talked about Yevul Shishis, we talked about Yevul Nachri, we talked about Matzah Menutak. I hope these words are familiar to you. We talked about Heter Mechira, and we talked about Otzer Basin. 6, right? So these are the 6 ways you get food during the Shemitah year, and each of them have different ramifications in terms of Kedushat Shvi'it, Sefichim, and everything else. Okay, any questions about the basic concepts? And stores that are Otzer Basin stores are labeled. There'll be Otzer Basin sign or whatever it is. I think there's one in Ramat Eshkol. Other neighborhoods have them, and the like. Okay. So now there is one more concept about Shemitah that I want to introduce, and that is the idea of Biyur. Biyur is like Biyur Chametz. Beis, Yud, Ayin, Vav, Reish. Biyur literally means eradication, clearing it out of your house. But Biyur is a little bit of a complicated word because it means different things in different contexts. There is not one definition of Biyur. When we talk about Biyur Chametz, we primarily mean to burn the Chametz or destroy the Chametz. Right? We do that Erev Pesach in the morning. We burn some Chametz because that Biyur Chametz. Yeah. Now there is, just as there's a mitzvah of Biyur Chametz, there's a mitzvah of Biyur Peiros Shvius, but it doesn't mean the same thing. At least like most Rishonim, it does not mean the same thing at all. And here is how it works: Peiros Shvius are hefker, okay, which means anybody could take them in limited quantities, and anybody could eat, any Jew that is, and can eat them, right? Peiros Shvius. And once I take it in, it's no longer hefker. What I take in my daily quantity, you can't take away from me. That would be stealing. It's not hefker once I take it into my house. But here is the rule: I am allowed to eat peiros shvius in my home as long as there still are enough produce or peiros of that species in the fields or in the trees that animals could get it. Meaning, I'm allowed to eat, let's take apples, right? So I have an apple tree. My apple tree is hefker. Anybody can come in and take Shemitah apples, including me. Okay, so I take Shemitah apples, you take Shemitah apples, Shimon takes Shemitah apples, Levi takes Shemitah apples. And I can keep on coming back. I could harvest, whatever I need for every day, I could harvest for myself and for my family. Now, how long can I keep it? Let's assume that I took a day's worth of apples, but I decided not to eat apples for a while. I'm tired of apples, right? So I can keep it in my house for the next day. It's not like man. Peiros shvius are not like man, even though the predicate of the harvest is like what you need for a day-to-day, but you don't have to eat it that day. So the halacha is you're only allowed to eat peiros shvius as long as that species, is matsui basadeh or be'ilan for behemoths. Once it is so decimated, the harvest has been so complete, that there's nothing left for the animals, you are no longer allowed to eat the Peiros Shvius. That's when the laws of Biyur become operative. Now, I didn't yet say what you have to do. Now, typically, the important thing to keep in mind is that this does not occur until the 8th year. Meaning to say, normally stuff that grew during Shemitah will have something remaining in the fields and in the trees until sometime in the 8th year. So Biyur is a law of Shemitah that is primarily relevant not in year 7, it is primarily relevant in year 8. Now, if I were to be asked to somehow give you a date of when peiros are no longer matzoi besada, I would have absolutely I would have no idea. I mean, avocados have one date, and apples have another date, and pears have another date, and dates have another date, and figs have another date. How on earth are you supposed to know? And why is there even an assumption that it's going to be the same date every year? I mean, it's not going to be a week difference, a day difference. So the whole notion of having a date of Biyur is very problematical, and yet Chazal did give us definitive dates for some things. Okay, that I understand. Chazal are Chazal, but strangely enough, modern poskim and agriculturalists have given us dates for virtually everything. So one of the things you can get it online, is you want to get a Biyur calendar, which will go through every fruit. Pears can be eaten until, I don't even know the dates, but pears can be eaten until, Rosh Hashanah, or, not it'll be a little later, till, let's say, Teves, and this is till Adar, and this is till Nisan, etc. There'll be a Shas HaBiyur for every type of fruit. Now, let's think about this. Will there be a Shas HaBiyur for vegetables and grain? Will there be some statement you can only eat wheat, bread, until a certain date? So b'pashtus, there won't be, because with respect to vegetables and grain that have Kedushas Shvius, there's an Isser Sapichim, so you're not even allowed to eat it during Shemitah itself. But like the Chazon Ish, who says that if the vegetable or grain had any above ground growth before Shemitah, there's no din of Sapichim, but there'll still be Kedushat Shvius. Indeed, Biyur will be relevant. That's why if you look at a Luach, you will see Zamanim of Biyur, even for grain and for vegetables. And you might be asking, what do you mean a Zaman Biyur for grain and vegetables? Grain and vegetables have an Isser Sapichim. The answer would be, Al Pi the Chazon Ish, when part of it began to grow before Shemitah, so there's no din of Sapichim, but there'll still be a din of Kedushas Shvius, which has Biyur. Biyur is totally on Kedushas Shvius and the like. Okay, so let's assume that I have Peiros of Shemitah, and the date of Biyur has arrived. Again, empirically, it makes no sense to me how you can even talk about a date of Biyur, but we are given dates of Biyur. I'll trust the calendar, assuming it's a reliable hashgacha that issues the calendar. So what that means is the following. On the date of Biyur, you must take whatever Peiros Shvius you have, you must take it outside of your house, and in front of 3 people that are not related to you, you declare that these are hefker. Anybody could take them. Anybody, that's why it has to be semi-public. Anybody could take these Peiros Shvius, meaning once the Zman HaBiyur comes, you are mechuyev to be mitzi the Peiros from your house, be mafker them in front of 3 people, and if they want to take it, they can take it. But assuming they don't take it, you are allowed, correct? Count to 5, quick, and take him back, and then you can bring it home. And once you've done that, Biyur never repeats itself. Once you were mafkir, bishas ha-Biyur, you are allowed to be rizocha. So essentially what Biyur really meant was, it was a way of, at least theoretically, redistributing the Peiros Shvius in a hefker way when there's no longer anything for people to take anymore. Although, as I say, there is an element of harama because you can be zocha in it afterwards and the like. And this is what Biyur is. Again, let me point out, you don't have to repeat it, meaning to say once you've done it, you can eat, these peiros are yours forever after that point. Now, so far so good, but here is the thing. If you had peiros shvius in your rishus on the day of Biyur, and on that day you neglected to be mafkir them, rabbinically, the peiros are now forbidden to be eaten, and they must be thrown away. Meaning, you're not allowed to eat peiros shvius if the day of Biyur has passed and you were not mekayem the mitzvah of Biyur. So, at some point, the initial stage of Biyur would be hefker. The second stage of Biyur might actually be destruction if the zman of Biyur passed. Now, let me just qualify with something that's a very important exception, and that is when you are mechuyev to be motzi your peiros shvius and be mafkir them, you are allowed to hold on to 3 meals worth for each member of your family. But by that I mean, let's go with apples. Typically, I mean, assuming you eat an apple after a meal, typically people will eat 1 apple, right? You're not going to eat 2. Usually, you're not going to eat 2 apples for dessert or whatever it is. So, if I have, let's say, 20 apples, so I'm allowed to withhold 3 apples times members of my family, right? So if I have 6 members of my family, I could withhold, 18 apples, and I only have to be mafkir the 2 apples, right? In other words, I'm allowed to be mishayer, what is called mazon shalosh seudais, and everything beyond the mazon shalosh seudas for every member of your family living. I don't mean your brother-in-law in Calgary. I mean, in other words, a member of family living under the same roof, and then I am mafkir the rest. And if I'm not mafkir the rest on the day of Biyur, those peiros are Otzer bahana. Okay, that is the concept of Biyur. Remember, this is a problem in the 8th year, not in the 7th year, and you need to have a luach. Again, I mean, for many people it may not be a problem. You may not have peiros shvius in your house. It's not going to be a big issue. But I'll tell you where it will be a big issue. Maybe I'll address it a little bit next week after Yom Tov, and that is it's an issue of wine, because Shemitta wine often resurfaces in later years, and you're going to have to know, was there a Biyur that was made with Shemitta wine? Now, final point. Otzer based in produce is already in a state of hefker, so there is no chiyuv for an Otzer based in. Now, be careful there. If I bought Otzer based in produce before the zman Biyur, then when the zman Biyur comes, I must be mavayir. But what is in the Otzer based in's possession at the time of Biyur does not have to be mavur because it's already in a state of hefker, and therefore that's fine. Okay, so be sure you know the difference here. What I buy from an Otzer basin before Biyur, I am mechuyev to be mavayir when the date comes. But what I buy from an Otzer basin after the zman Biyur is no problem, because everything in the Otzer basin's rishus is already in a state of hefker. Okay? Anyway, I have a good Kabbalah.